Welcome to episode 134 of 10 Minute Record Reviews. And today I'm going to talk about The Who's 1970 release, Live at Leeds, their first live album and their only live album featuring the original four members of the group. This is an album which has been called the greatest live album in rock history. This is not the jangly, modish, kind of inarticulate and confused band of the early days. This is not the art pop or concept album band of the later 1960s. This is the band who are on the cusp of becoming the arena rock record setters that they would be through the rest of the 1970s. In short, this is an album by one of England's loudest bands. So The Who took a bit of time to settle as a band. I think if you can say of AC/DC that they've released the same album 15 times in a row, The Who have never really released the same album twice. In 1967, they released an album called The Who Sell Out, which was a concept album. It was a tribute to pirate radio. It had some parody commercials. It had a mini rock opera, which never really went anywhere. It had a genuine hit in I Can See for Miles. And it also kind of launched them into their art pop phase. Townsend was pronounced them to be an art rock band or an art pop band, and that they lived art pop on and off the stage. But if their studio work had a few pretensions, their live work was increasingly robust and muscular. They did a tour of Australia in 1968 with the Small Faces, which did not go very well. People liked the music, but they ran into trouble with the police. Eventually they're arrested in Melbourne. They're kicked out of the country. The Prime Minister of the day sends The Who a telegram saying, basically never come back to Australia again, and they didn't come back to Australia for 36 years. Notwithstanding all that hoo-ha, Townsend's intellectual side is also kicking into gear here, and in 1968 he's getting heavily into Meher Baba, the Indian spiritual leader, and he's also starting to work on his magnum opus, Tommy, and a lot of the themes of Baba's work end up finding their way into the lyrics of Tommy. So they're doing all this already concept work in the record, but at the same time they're building a rep as a pretty ferocious and very tight live outfit. That summer they played the Woodstock Festival. They had that famous 5 a.m. set with the sun coming up while they were playing See Me, Feel Me. As Ed Whistle said, it's like God was their lighting director. They also had the famous contretemps between Pete Townsend and Abby Hoffman. They then played the Isle of Wight. They didn't really like the Woodstock gig, but they loved playing the Isle of Wight. And after both of those concerts, which of course gave them enormous amounts of exposure to the music press in both the US and the UK, they are pretty much the consensus choice as the best live rock act around. However, if you've listened to their records leading up to that point, they rock, but they don't rock nearly as hard as they did live. And the band were very conscious of that contrast and wanted an album, a live album, that would actually document how they were on stage as opposed to the artier music which they were recording in the studio. They toured fairly extensively in the US prior to the Woodstock concert, and they had a bunch of tapes from those shows. And the idea was to take those tapes and edit them down into a live document. But Townsend, for whatever reason, didn't want to delve into all those tapes, and amazingly enough, had them burned, so completists look away now, scream silently into a pillow, what have you. And what they decided to do instead was to schedule a couple of shows in England, one in Leeds and one in Hull, both in the north of England, and use those shows as a material for a live album. I think that turn of events was really quite fortuitous because The Who, unlike, for instance, Zeppelin, were fundamentally an English band. Zeppelin really appealed to an American audience. It makes sense to listen to Zeppelin in front of an American audience which is kind of laid back and stoned, as opposed to drunk and maybe a little bit aggressive, like an English audience. And The Who are kind of made to record in front of an English audience. It's kind of who they are as people, and it just makes much more sense hearing an English crowd with this particular set. The whole show doesn't actually work out because there was a problem miking the bass, so they're really only left with the Leeds tapes. Townsend then took those tapes and listened to them and picked out the material for an album. The original show had included most of Tommy, but Townsend excludes almost all of that. I think that makes a big difference. The full show, of course, has circulated for years and has been released officially. The Tommy stuff is all well and good, but a lot of it is important to narrative. It is not visceral. It does not help a crowd get its musical rocks off the way that the tracks which ultimately are included in this album do. And I think that basically honors the idea which the band had in the first place, which was to show that they had a whole other side to their personality as well as the conceptual piece. This show was performed on Valentine's Day in 1970 in Leeds, at Leeds University, in a dining hall in the Leeds University refectory. Growing up listening to this record, I always imagined that this was recorded in a big open field kind of a stadium with a much larger crowd than you could fit in a dining hall. I think that's because, as I've subsequently learned, there was no microphone actually applied to the crowd. So the crowd you only hear indirectly, and therefore they sound further away than they actually are. That's no failing of this record, because if anything, it means the sound of the band is a lot cleaner and easier to hear. Side one starts with Young Man Blues. For me, the opening blast, crescendo, what have you, of this song is coming out of the speakers. It's just one of the great moments in rock history. It just leaps out of your stereo like a cannon. Townsend's sound he was getting from an SG at this point is really cool. His variations in tone are really cool. This is as aggressive a sound as any rock musician was achieving anywhere in the world in 1969. And that's not even the best part about the song, because I think the best part about the song is Moon's drumming, which is just so frenetically Moon and on point right from the get-go. And Daltrey's delivery of this song and the lyrics and the emotion in it is just so legit. It's like all of this energy and aggression like almost balled up into a fist, and it's all released in the end in that declaration, "Sweet fuck all," which to me, as a kid growing up in rural Canada, was a revelation. I didn't know you could swear on a record. I thought that was amazing. It was scandalous. It's followed by Substitute, which is the only kind of really faithful version of a song on this record. I always think this song is a little bit weird. It feels like a gangly and sort of half-formed tune compared to the sophistication of Townsend's writing just a few years later. It's originally recorded in 1966, and it's kind of instructive, I think, to listen to it and compare it to I Can See for Miles, recorded not long after, which is, I think, a much more coherent summation of what The Who could do, whereas Substitute always feels like less than some of its parts, if that makes any sense. The third song on side one is Summertime Blues. This is, of course, a song by Eddie Cochran, the then late departed early American rocker. And this is a much heavier version than the original. It really rocks very hard. The last song on side one is Shakin' All Over, which is a cover of a song by Johnny Kidd and the Pirates, who were a UK rock band from the late 50s and early 1960s. It's a blazing three-chord wonder of a song, much, much heavier than the original. It's also got the riff, which is nothing more or less than a standard blues scale in E, just picked in descending order. Simplicity at its finest, and a great song to learn if you're just starting out on the guitar. Side two begins with their famous track, My Generation. This actually was the first version of that song that I ever heard. I didn't have another version with the original studio track on for a number of years when I was a kid. When I eventually heard the studio version, I actually thought it was kind of wimpy. And in retrospect, my favorite version of the track these days is actually the one which they do on the Smothers Brothers, which is kind of the happy medium between this version, which is very heavy, and the studio version. This, however, is pretty great. It's 50 minutes long. It also includes bits of Sparks, includes bits of See Me, Feel Me, includes bits of Naked Eye, which was a song which didn't get released officially for many years, which was part of the whole Lighthouse project, which Townsend was working on, which eventually got abandoned in favor of the song lineup for Who's Next. The last song is Magic Bus, which is one of my favorite Who songs. Like a lot of Who songs, it's kind of a one-off. They had a habit of doing a song in a particular format or style with nothing else like it in their catalog. That's true of this, that's true of Baba O'Reilly, that's true of Pinball Wizard, I Can See for Miles. It's true of a whole bunch of songs in their catalog. What I love about this song, which I love about the studio version, but it's even better live, is the interplay between Townsend and Daltrey. They kind of, I want the Magic Bus, no, you can't have it, and they're haggling over the cost and so on. That's great. Again, like the previous song, it's also a little bit sloppy, but the sloppiness is kind of the point. Super version, just breathless rock and roll from start to finish. You can't put this album on at a party, really. You can't really dance this album. You can't really have it on in the background. You can't really put it on while you're doing your homework. This is full-on, high-energy, live rock and roll. Gibson guitar overdriven, full-throated vocals over top of that, and a rhythm section, which is one of the great rhythm sections in rock and roll, absolutely their historical peak. The original 6-song single album is the way to go. Townsend knew intuitively, I think, what was bringing them real acclaim, and it was their live work, that big, epic, high-energy sound. And I do not think it is in any way accidental that their very next studio outing would really distill that sound for the very first time for this band on record. But for this album, if you don't like hard rock, don't bother. But for the rest of us, it's 5 out of 5.